We're recording. Isn't that crazy? Yeah, it was the New York Browning Society. And Bob, do you know the exact story? It was Philip Kelly, I do believe, who was the president who saved
Yeah.
the contiguity.
The first London Browning Society, as you probably know, was London. The second was Boston, and in the 1880s, when Browning was still alive. And the third was New York, us in 1907. And I don't really know who the early people were involved, but I do know that Browning actually attended the London Browning Society at one point. I think one meeting. So I don't know that there's any other poetry societies around that long, at least in this country.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating how the Brownings, because Robert wasn't particularly well regarded early in his career. I mean, Elizabeth was, but how that grew and developed is fascinating. So in 2017, I spent a semester on a fellowship at the Armstrong Browning Library in Waco, of all places. I don't know if you guys have been there, but man, it's amazing. It's like a shrine to the Brownings.
Temple to the Brownings.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It was beautiful. It was really neat to be there, and to play with the collection.
Yeah, the stained glass is immaculate, and they have the whole contiguity room set up there in the library, so you can see all the effects and all the original furniture and such.
Yeah,
the people there are top notch. They
are, yeah. Yeah, and that piano is to die for. I started playing the piano when I turned 50 as sort of a gift to the second half of my life. And so I love playing pianos that I don't know in neat places. And that one there is up at the top, the one in that beautiful big marble main space.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. Yeah, that's how I came about finding you for this talk. Was you had done the presentation at the Armstrong Browning Library in regards to Elizabeth Barrett Browning saving the what was the name of saving the arts and
saving the humanities. That's right.
Yeah. So I had received a postcard from them wanting me to attend, and I have it on my wall. And I was like, well, who can we get for the next month? It's like, oh, why don't we try this guy? Yeah. So we're very glad to have you. And as you can see, we have people trickling in.
Mm-hmm.
How's everything, Griff? I like how you go by. Is it Griff you like to go by? Robert.
Me?
Yes, you just have.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. You just have your name listed as Griff. I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I noticed that, and I said, why bother filling the whole thing in? I'll just leave it alone. It was already on there. I didn't put that in.
Well, unfortunately, Stephen Downey, one of our former presidents, passed in December, but he used to tell a great story about how Robert Browning would attend the actual London Browning Society meetings, and he would sit in the back, and he kind of, because he was a shorter guy, so he'd kind of slump in his seat, and then the word would go around the room, hey, the old man's in the back. So I thought that was kind of a funny little anecdote in regards to being able to attend your own literary society, I suppose. Laura, hello, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
We're doing very well. We typically, it's 6:01. We typically wait till about, 6:05, 6:06 to let people kind of trickle in, and then we'll get started with the presentation. I know there's several people that are supposed to be here. So how's your day?
My day's great.
Good. Good.
Where is everybody? Where are you?
We're in New York City. I'm in New York City.
Okay.
Dino, where are you?
I teach at Purdue University, so I'm talking to you from West Lafayette, Indiana, in my office, as you can see.
Oh, nice. Welcome, Laura.
Okay, well, I'm in San Diego, so.
That's why it was so beautiful and sunny out the window.
That's why we got this afternoon light coming in. Yeah.
It's a small enough group that it would be nice to hear from the rest of you, where you are and who you are.
Candace, where are you from?
I'm in Nebraska. It's very cold.
You're at the university or just in town or just in the state?
I live here.
Uh-huh.
And I'm in Sarasota, Florida.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
we doing
Wonderful.
What's that?
I said I'm in Sarasota. We moved here for the arts. The place is incredible.
And Laura, where are you coming from?
New York City, it's snowing today. It's freezing.
It is.
Up in Inwood.
Uh-huh.
And Pratika, is that how I pronounce your name? Pratika? Is that
Yes, Pritika. Hello. Hi, my name is Pritika. I'm currently in Minnesota, where for I think once in the past 100 days, it is not snowing today.
Well,
Hi,
that's nice.
Pritika.
Hi, Laura. Thank you for having me here.
Dino, if you would like to invite me to your new place in Italy, I'll invite you to Sarasota. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, I actually kind of hope that I'll be able to find house swaps because nobody wants to house swap my place in West Lafayette, Indiana. But Tuscany is a different story.
I think I must have missed that. You've just bought a house in Tuscany.
I did, yeah. It's yeah, and I haven't bought it yet. The closing is May 30th, but all of the paperwork's done. So we're just here. I'll show it to you if you'd like. Here.
Congratulations. I'm very jealous.
There's the
Lovely.
place there.
Oh,
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so it's the house there.
Lovely.
gorgeous.
Looks beautiful. You're planning to sort of spend the summers, the sort of academic holidays there, or what's your?
Well, I have a father-in-law who's 100 years old. He turns 100 in May. And the crazy thing we're planning to do now is to bring him to Italy for his last years and split care with my brother-in-law in the house. The house is very accessible, beautiful views, but the house itself is perfectly flat and there are no steps at all. So that's our plan.
It's so wonderful you're doing that. It's funny, my husband's grandfather, who's now 97, had a place in Italy, and it was his dream to be there now, but the family logistics, they haven't been able to take him, and that really was his dream. So I just think that's so wonderful that you're doing that.
Yeah, my brother-in-law's just retired from guitar building, so he wants to move there, and I'll be taking sabbatical this fall and just playing it by ear going forward.
Guitar building, huh?
Yeah, he does. He makes high-end bass electric guitars.
Oh, that's so cool.
And in fact, he took it as a sign that he looked on, I think it was eBay, and there were 2 of his guitars for sale right in Lucca, near where our house is.
And let's see, we got 9, 10 people. So you
The
just
Browns love Luca. It was one of their favorite spots.
Yeah, well, I was saying that I'll be in Asolo too this spring or in May, because I take a group of students from honors college students from Purdue there. I wasn't able to do it for a while, but I'd like to do it every year because it's good for them to be exposed to other cultures. And Oslo is one of the places we go.
Then there was a reading on the website of the London Browning Society, which I really need to join and haven't yet, that there's some kind of secret thing where you have to go to Italy and show that you've been there and you become some sort of special member. Am I making that up? I feel like I read that on their website.
It's the Fano Club.
I saw that and I was like, I'm going to do that one day.
I know. Yeah. Only Fano isn't very near to other places, so it's a little tricky. But yes, I want to do that too.
All right, well, it's 6:06 p.m. I guess we should just get started. I'm going to let everybody come in as they come. So I'm going to introduce you, Dino. We're very gracious to have Dr. Dino Franco Felluga with us today. He's going to be putting on a fantastic performance. A little bit about Dr. Felluga. Bob Kramer is calling in on the phone. Kramer, are you on the Zoom? I don't know. Hold on one second. Kramer, are you joining us on the Zoom? Sounds like he's in jail. It's one of those things where it's like, Robert Kramer, will you accept the call as the vice president of the society? Robert, what kind of trouble are you in? Okay, so I just recommend shutting down everything, restarting the computer, and joining us again, okay? And if that doesn't work, text me, all right? All right, we're introducing the speaker right now. That was Robert Kramer. He's coming. Apparently there's some sort of system malfunction on his end. We're hoping and praying that he'll be able to figure out, you know, he's an 89-year-old man. We gave him a computer to make sure that he got to all the meetings. So without further ado, let's introduce Dr. Dino Franco Felluga. Dino Franco Felluga is a professor of English and director of literature, theory, and cultural studies at Purdue University. His articles have appeared in SEL, Studies in English Literature, Victorian Studies, Criticism, Victorian Poetry, European Romantic Review, Critical Quarterly, 19, the Journal of Victorian Culture, and the Blackwell Companion of Victorian Poetry. His first book, The Perversity of Poetry, Romantic Ideology and the Popular Male Poet of Genius, was published by SUNY Press in 2005. It was followed by the 4-volume, million-word Encyclopedia of Victorian Literature and Critical Theory, The Key Concept. He's also the general editor of Branch, the Britain Representation in 19th Century History, and COVE, the Collaborative Organization for Virtual Education. His current book project, Novel Poetry, co-written with Emily Allen, explores the cross-influence of poetry and the novel in the 19th century. Professor Felluga also created the North American Victorian Studies Association and served as NAFSA's president for the first 11 years of the organization. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm round of applause for Dr. Dino Franco Felluga.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation. And in fact, that is what I'm going to give you, is a section from that book, Novel Poetry. Full title is The Shape of the Real and the Problem of Form. And what it does is it tries to look at literary history differently, insofar as my co-writer, Emily Allen, is a novel critic and I'm a poetry critic. And we try to attack the novel from a different perspective by looking at it in terms of its conversation with poetry. And then a second half of the book is on a variety of verse novels. We do Don Juan, Amour de Voyage, Modern Love, Aurora Lee, and Ring in the Book. So this is actually what I'm going to give you, the last chapter of the book, just before the epilogue. And yeah, I think that's all you need to know. So I'm going to get started here. This is, the title is Browning and the Virtuous Act. Now, as this group well knows, Robert Browning was fascinated throughout his career in evil. How, he often asked, can we distinguish a transformative act in the service of a just ideal from one that imposes the will of a single person or of a group onto others? The question anticipates an influential trajectory of critical theory and Western politics over the last 50 years, which is motivated by a fear that, as Alain Badiou, a philosopher, puts it, every revolutionary project is stigmatized as utopian turns into a totalitarian nightmare. So the fear that any utopian vision is problematic. Browning interrogates religion and love in his poetry, in particular. For example, linking the two in what he dubbed Madhouse Cells, the conjoined poems later titled Johannes Agricola and Meditation and Porphyria's Lover, first published in 1836 in the Monthly Repository and then collected alongside My Last Duchess in Dramatic Lyrics in 1842. Now, those early poems showcase Browning's attention to the ideological valences of form, which is what I'll explore today by turning to The Ring and the Book, which I'm sure you all know is a series of 12 dramatic monologues that each retell a single sensational narrative of murder and betrayal. And what interests me throughout that book that I just completed is how Browning fits into and perpetuates a formal alternative in 19th century verse novels that subscribes neither to lyricism nor narrative, as those terms are generally understood by contemporary scholarship. So right now, scholarship tends to be divided: poetry, lyric critics on the one hand, novel critics on the other. But what we do is look at the verse novel to show that there was this other tradition that nobody really thinks about. Very few people talk about the verse novel. It's becoming something that a few people have begun to talk about, and it offers an alternative sort of literary history. This aesthetic, we argue in that book, happened also to offer 19th century readers a distinctive alternative morality from that found in either the realist novel or lyric verse. Like Herbert F. Tucker in his book Browning's Beginnings, I'd like to resist here today the desire, quote, and this is Tucker, to exalt either form or content, either morals or aesthetics, at the expense of the other. By examining the two together, we can better understand the competing models for action and subjectivity available both to the Victorians and to us as critics today. Now, I agree with Tucker that, quote, any aesthetic deeply considered will disclose a moral position, and no morality is without its aesthetic side. For that reason, we need, I think, to disentangle Browning's approach to the subject's temporality from Wordsworth's, and also from Tucker's, who we find to be spot on in all but his alignment of Browning's temporal structure with that of the prelude. To be more precise, we argue that we need to distinguish between Browning's relationship to Wordsworth at the start of his career. Tucker's book, Browning's Beginning, stops at the 1855 Men and Women, from what Browning does with temporality and subjectivity after the 1856 publication of Aurora Leigh, which greatly influenced what Browning does in Ring and the Book. Now, I noticed that there's a little bit of background noise. I think you're in a position to maybe mute some of those just so that it's not distracting to others who are listening. Can you do that? Do you know? Thanks. Tucker's opening chapter, Browning and the Future, aims to make sense of the poet's engagement with the infinite, pinpointing a phrase that he draws from a letter from Browning to Ruskin, quote, all poetry being a putting the infinite within the finite. As Tucker goes on, one seizes on this absolute phrase as the nearest thing in Browning to a commitment that might serve as the foundation for a general poetics, end quote. In our book, we agree, let me say I agree. It's kind of hard. I'll sometimes switch between I and we because it is a co-written book. Where we part ways with Tucker is in his connection of this temporality to the following lines from the Simplon Pass episode of the Prelude. Our destiny, our being's heart and home is with infinitude and only there. With hope it is, hope that can never die, effort and expectation and desire, and something evermore about to be. Tucker argues, quote, Wordsworth's lines enact precisely the revision of infinitude from a spatial to a temporal concept that is required by Browning's letter to Ruskin. And as he goes on to explain, it is not with a sense of spatial transcendence or immanence, but with a sense of temporal immanence, that it is immanent, of something evermore about to be, that greatness makes abode for Wordsworth. And there it also abides for Browning, whose infinite describes not some eternal realm above mutability, but the conviction of endlessness or processionality to which the careful imperfections of his art of disclosure give poetic currency, end quote. Now, given the significance of Wordsworth's temporal model, not only for the history of lyric poetry, but also for the novel, as, for example, Frank Kermode argues in The Sense of an Ending, this is no small point. My argument here today is that we have in Browning less a temporality of the future than a temporality of what philosophers like Alain Badiou have termed the future anterior, the will have been. And this is something that we explore in the book. We think that through the verse novel and an alternative temporality and approach to morality can be traced that's very different from the way novels think about that and the way lyric poems think about that. Tucker quotes Browning's 1855 poem Transcendentalism after seeing in Browning an example of Wordsworth's strength of usurpation. This is Tucker. At its moments of greatness, the Protestant poetry of Browning also involves a usurpation or transgression of given limits, end quote. This lining up of Wordsworth and Browning is to some extent undercut in the poem itself, however, whether we read transcendentalism as a critique of Browning's own previous poetry, as Richard Altick argues, or as a direct critique of the poetry of Wordsworth. After all, the full title, Transcendentalism, a Poem in 12 Books, could not help but call to mind the recently published 1850 prelude in 14 books. Reacting to the charge of obscurity in his own poetry, to Carlyle's exhortation to both Browning and EBB that they should begin writing instead in prose, and to Wordsworth's aim to adapt poetry to the real language used by men, Browning responds to the demand to speak prose and hello it till Europe hears. And this is Browning, but here's your fault. Grown men want thought, you think. Thoughts what they mean by verse and seek in verse. Boys seek for images and melody. Men must have reason, so you aim at men. The goal should not be to explain to men in prose or prosaic poetry the transcendental wonder of the world, Browning claims in his poem, but through verse to explode in the present an infinity that lies hidden behind the world of referential objects. Quote, in there breaks the sudden rose herself, over us, under, round us, every side, nay, in and out the tables and the chairs and musty volumes, end quote. In the first half of the 1850s, Browning still thought, like Wordsworth, about the connection of this experience with a romanticized understanding of nature and the innocence of childhood. Again, here's quoting the poem, objects throng our youth, 'tis true, we see and hear and do not wonder much, end quote. Poetry in this way of thinking resuscitates the wonder of childhood. It, quote, buries us with a glory young once more, pouring heaven into this shut house of life, end quote. At this stage of his career, Browning approached the experience of eternity as a revival of lost spots of time and thought of childhood as an innocent good that is lost in our acceptance of life's prosaic quote the poem again, the best of all you did before, believe, was your own boy's face o'er the finer chords bent, following the cherub at the top that points to God with his paired half-moon wings. The Ring in the Book, published in 1868 and surely influenced by the 1856 publication of Aurora Leigh, not to mention the other verse novels Emily Allen and I examine in our novel poetry book, recasts its temporality along different lines, albeit always in a way that remains skeptical of any imminent or imminent claim to truth. Before 1856, Browning occasionally connects the good with lost innocence. For example, the simple idealism of Pippa in the 1841 poem, Pippa Passes. The years at the spring and days at the morn, mornings at 7, the hillsides dew-pearled, the larks on the wing, the snails on the thorn, God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. And this way of thinking about moral action, we need not move beyond the simple acts of quotidian existence, provided we begin with a love for all men, which Browning, like the Romantics, here appears to associate with the innocence of youth before adulthood makes us face a variety of moral quandaries. As Pippa sings, all service ranks the same with God. If not, as formerly he trod paradise, his presence fills our earth, each only as God wills can work. God's puppets, best and worst are we. There is no last nor first. Say not a small event. Why small? Costs it more pain than this? Ye call a great event should come to pass than that. Untwine me from the mass of deeds which make up life. One deed power shall fall short in or exceed. Pippa's surprising impact on the people she passes in her town of Oslo over the course of the poem is unintended. I think there's still some feedback there from somebody's mic on there. If you could, yeah, thanks. Pippa's surprising impact on the people she passes in her town of Oslo over the course of the poem is unintended, an effect of her innocent faith, rather than the result of any profound moral struggle. Temporality here is reduced to the fitful sunshine and its coming going of the present moment. Quote, "Thou art my single day, God lends to leven. What were all earth else with a feel of heaven?" Now, in the 1855 Men and Women, some poems, like Transcendentalism, repeat the conflation of truth with childhood innocence. Others, though, begin to formulate the idea of a long and sometimes painful search for universal truth that transcends the constraints of the present. Browning places his most succinct statement of his moral and aesthetic principle, "A man's reach should exceed his grasp," or "What's a heaven for?" in the mouth of a figure who fails to achieve it. What leads us to condemn Andrea del Sarto is the fact that he understands art's aspiration after what Browning characterizes as universal truths, as he says of a work by Raphael, "Its soul is right, he means right, that a child may understand." Yet, Andrea del Sarto refuses to engage in the struggle himself. The temporality of this search after universal truth is quite different than that of transcendence or Pippa Passes. The goal is not to recover a lost innocence or to glory in the splendor of nature, but the struggle after truths that transcend custom, a struggle that subsequently places the individual in a position out of joint with the present. That struggle is presented in a form that resembles the future anterior that in novel poetry, Emily Allen and I explore also in Byron and EBB, this new way of thinking about temporality. And here's Browning. "Her works drop groundward, but themselves, I know, reach many a time a heaven that's shut to me, enter and take their place there, sure enough, though they come back and cannot tell the world." End quote. As in Plato's allegory of the cave, we're presented with the discovery of a universal truth and then the difficulty of expressing that truth to those who are still chained, observing only shadows. In Andrea del Sarto and his later work, Browning rejects the Wordsworthian temporality of lost innocence in favor of a wisdom achieved through struggle. For Wordsworth, the best philosopher is a child who has visionary access to the truths of the natural world. But when Browning writes, "Its soul is right, he means right, that a child may understand," he does not give the child any special access to truth. Quite the opposite, for even the ignorant can recognize such a truth when it erupts in the world. The good will be found not in innocence, but struggle. Quote, "In this world, who can do a thing will not, and who would do it cannot." We judge Andrea del Sarto, in other words, for his unwillingness to pursue in the present moment the ideal truths that he is capable of recognizing, including unselfish love. He chooses instead self-interest. "It is true, I took his coin, was tempted, and complied." Immorality for Browning is knowledge of the good accompanied by the unwillingness to act in its name now in the present. "I regret little, I would change still less," Andrea del Sarto ultimately confesses, and imagines himself acting instead in a fantasized time after death. "This must suffice me here. What would one have? In heaven, perhaps new chances, one more chance. 4 great walls in the New Jerusalem, meted on each side by the angels, read for Leonard, Raphael, Agnolo, and me, to cover the 3 first without a wife while I have mine. So still they overcome because they're still Lucrezia as I choose." Here we can see clearly how the figuration of a New Jerusalem can be either purely feckless, a fantasy of endless deferral, as it is for Andrea del Sarto, or a revolutionary call to action in the present, as it is for Aurora Leigh, the argument we make in our book. Teleology is not itself grounds for immediate dismissal, we argue. What matters is how the figuration is structured temporally and how it bears on our actions in the present. That's our argument in that chapter. People tend to discount Elizabeth Barrett Browning as overly idealistic, and often even just because her work includes religious sentiment. But our argument is that it matters how that sentiment is structured with regard to morality and action in the present. In Browning's Platonic model, the ignorant child or animal is neither good nor evil, caught as either is in pure self-interest, as is Caliban, for example, and Dramatis Personae from 1864. In this and other poems of his later career, Browning moves away from Wordsworth and the Socratic falling away from the good and comes closer to Badiou's understanding of evil, which follows from a future anterior understanding of the struggle to find universal collectivist truths. According to Badiou, the human animal in itself implies no value judgment. It is beneath good and evil and concerned merely with survival, like Caliban. Only through confrontation with what Badiou characterizes as an infinite truth, a truth that goes beyond opinion and received knowledge, does the human animal recognize a different possibility. This is Badiou. The routines of survival are different to any good you might care to mention. Every pursuit of an interest has success as its only source of legitimacy. On the other hand, if I fall in love, or if I am seized by the sleepless fury of a thought, or if some radical political engagement proves incompatible with every immediate principle of interest, then I find myself compelled to measure life, my life, as a socialized human animal against something other than itself. End quote. Evil in this way of thinking is by no means ignorance of the good. It arises rather as the possible effect of the good itself. That's Badiou. So I have two parts. Both of these parts are trying to think through the formal logic of Ring in the Book and explain why that aesthetic formal element links up with moral questions. And there are two questions, questions of truth, questions of virtue. So the first part's questions of truth, the Ring in the Book. We're now in a position to understand more clearly the relation of morality and aesthetic form in the Ring in the Book, and why Browning spends so much time in this work exploring questions of ethics, justice, evil, custom, and truth. Michael McKeon in Origins of the English Novel has argued that questions of virtue and questions of truth were crucial to the development of both the novel and the bourgeois subject as formal categories. I'll begin with questions of truth. As its very title suggests, Browning verse novel is about both things and forms. But what is so remarkable is the extent to which it troubles the relationship between the two. Engaging the Victorian novel's own fascination with realistically rendered things and referents, the Ring in the Book asks us to interrogate the novel's claim to present us with a window onto the world of things. I'll begin with such questions of truth in this section, the understanding of content and form, tenor and vehicle, referent and representation, before returning to the work's closely connected questions of virtue in the next section. Now, Browning's poem, in fact, begins with a referential gesture. Do you see this ring? The reader is thus thrown into this epic-length work, quite literally in medias res, into the middle of things, in such a way that we cannot help but recognize that, in fact, we cannot literally see the object things, this ring thing, as he puts it, that a mimetically referential tale proffers for our world making. Lyric poetry works in opposition to the facts of realism because it asks us not only to see the things described, but also to recognize the metaphoric equivalences that take us away from temporal contiguity to the promise of an atemporal, synchronic, lyric time that figures the possibility of transcendence out of this world of things, which is how Browning indeed finishes the first book of his poem in his address to lyric love, half angel and half bird. Thither, where eyes that cannot reach yet yearn for all hope, all sustainment, all reward, their utmost up and on. Now, the verse novels of the 1850s and 60s that experimented with the temporal and spatial expansiveness of the novel asks us to see a depicted world, thus engaging in the fictional strategy of realism, yet they also emphasize the formal nature of poetry and make opaque the page that might tease us with transport to the diegetic world of things signified. The very line breaks matter as much as any matter referenced, form thus trumping any ring thing, as that very phrase suggests, alluding as it does to the formal structure of rhyme, ring, thing, within Browning's blank verse poem. Even as the poem's canvas paints for us a world, in other words, pure, crude fact secreted from man's life when hearts beat hard, as Browning puts it, it reflects nothing but itself, the sounds of the very words we hear rather than see. The iambic meter, when hearts beat hard, that returns in this line after the insistent spondee of pure, crude fact, would have us forget the poetic form that sets itself between us and the thing signified. Either way, poetry calls attention to the beat of meter, not to mention the sound of rhyme and alliteration, or the warp and woof of caesura, enjambment, end stop, break, all of which call the reader's attention to the fabric of the words outside of their representational function. Browning questions the substantiality of that ring thing, first by calling attention to the music of the poetic line, giving us, despite the blank verse of the poem, not one, but two internal rhymes in the line, air, where, ring, thing. He also calls attention to the fact of meter, starting with an awkward spondee, ere the stuff grow a ring thing right to wear, then repeating the phrase to write the meter, the thing, a ring, all while discussing in lines full of alliteration the artifice that gives to things their form. That trick is, the artificer melts up wax with honey, so to speak. He mingles gold with gold's alloy, and duly tempering both, effects a manageable mass, then works, but his work ended, once the thing a ring, oh, there's repristination, just a spurt of the proper fiery acid o'er its face, and forth the alloy unfastened flies in fume. While self-sufficient now, the shape remains, the rondure brave, the lilied loveliness, gold as it was, is, shall be evermore, prime nature with an added artistry. Indeed, he follows these lines by giving the lie to his opening referential gesture, clarifying that the ring is in fact a figure, a symbol, say, a thing's sign, now for the thing signified, end quote. Only to repeat the gesture yet again. Do you see this square old yellow book I toss in the air and catch again and twirl about by the crumpled vellum covers? Pure, crude fact, end quote. In this case, though he refers to the book that precisely gives us the thing sign, we can acknowledge that we do have a material analog for this referential gesture, not the thing signified by reading the book, but the very book in all its thingness that we hold in our hands. We cannot but raise questions of form when discussing the verse novel, since one of the remarkable things about it is precisely its formlessness. However pervasive the form in the period, there are no taxonomic features that define it as a genre, no one meter or stanzaic structure or rhyme scheme. Modern Love is very, very different from Ring in the Book, which is very different from Aurora Leigh, and so on. Not only do the forms of novel and poetry collide in the verse novel, but the very possibility of genre is also exploded in these works in favor of those form things that step outside of genre altogether. In novel poetry, Emily Allen and I discuss a number of similar maneuvers in the verse novels that preceded Ring in the Book. Each of these works, Byron's Don Juan, Clough's Amour de Voyage, Meredith's Modern Love, EBB's Aurora Leigh, interrogates the very nature of both lyricism and fictionality. Since my goal is to understand better the structural mechanisms by which poetry in the novel makes sense of representation generally, including the competing understandings of referentiality itself, since an objective, descriptive representation of the external world could be said to work in tension, even in the novel, with a realistic representation of internal thought processes, I want to press further on Browning's Ring in the Book metaphor, which illustrates how self-conscious he was about the issues involved and about engaging the novel. Although the ring would seem to be a referential object, it functions also as a form thing, a non-referential figure, a symbol, a thing sign. The book itself, which we would normally open to seek the thing signified, turns into a referential object. Small quarto size, part print, part manuscript, a book in shape, but really pure, crude fact, end quote. In the logic of this metaphor, Gold stands for truth, pure, crude fact, and the ring for artifice, the form that brings facts to life. As Browning states, now, as the ingot, ere the ring was forged, lay gold, beseech you, hold that figure fast. So in this book lay absolutely truth, fanciless fact. He then repeats this figure a little later. This is the bookful, thus far take the truth, the untempered gold, the fact untampered with, the mere ring metal, ere the ring be made. In between those two explanations of his figure, Browning gives us the basic facts of an actual 1698 murder case, a synopsis of the events that we will read about again and again from different perspectives in each of the books that follow. Even this, however, is little more than an expansion of the long paratextual title of the real book Browning found in a Florentine marketplace, which he translates for us at lines 120 to 31, thus giving in nuce the narrative plot of historical events. As he concludes wryly at the end of this section, that was this old square yellow book about. To complicate his figure yet further, in Pompilia, Browning makes a real ring an element of the plot itself. Pompilia, who along with her parents is murdered by her jealous husband, Count Guido Franceschini, is particularly concerned with questions of truth, as she claims, "What was all I said but truth, even when I found that such as are untrue could only take the truth in through a lie. Now I am speaking truth to the truth's self." Yet that declaration of truth is troubled by the very figure, the ring thing, that Browning adopts to frame his own tale. According to Pompilia, her maid Margarita is working for her husband, who is sending Pompilia forged letters to entrap her by asking for, quote, "a ring to show for token," as proof of her intent to commit adultery. Pompilia's maid importunes at one point, "Just hear the pretty verse he made today, a sonnet from Mirtillo, peerless, fair, ... All poetry is difficult to read. The sense of it is, anyhow, he seeks to leave to contrive you an escape from hell, and for that purpose asks an interview. The formal complexity of this mise en abîme moment is breathtaking. Robert Browning speaks in the voice of Pompilia, who is addressed by Margarita, who quotes a poem by Mirtillo, a fictional avatar evoking pastoral conventions, who pens a poem that Margarita claims to be from Caponsacchi, although the letter and the poem are in fact both forged by Guido. In the middle of this Hall of Mirrors, Browning includes a nod to lyric transcendent address, peerless fair, recast now as narrative device, a trap set by Guido to catch Pompilia in the act. Lyric poetry becomes the bait, and a golden ring becomes the token of faithlessness. Browning concludes Pompilia's monologue by rejecting both the marital ring and the gold that makes it. Marriage on earth seems such a counterfeit, mere imitation of the inimitable. In heaven, we have the real and true and sure, end quote. Browning completes this book, that is, by returning to his opening metaphor of gold, only to reject the ring altogether. Quote, "Marriage making for the earth, with gold so much, birth, power, repute so much, or beauty, youth so much, in lack of these, be as the angels rather, who apart know themselves into one, are found at length married, but marry never, know, nor give in marriage." Browning does not avoid the numinous here so much as present it as that which no earthly thing or form can ever grasp. Browning provides a, quote, plot of lyricism resisted, which is how Herbert Tucker understands Browning's dramatic monologues in general, but also a plot of realism resisted, leaving us with nothing but the artifice of form to give us something, quote, beyond the facts, suffice the eye, and save the soul beside. According to Browning, art alone can save us from false belief, regardless of whether we talk about religion, ideology, or representation, and it does so by teaching one thing, this lesson, that our human speech is not, our human testimony false, our fame and human estimation, words and wind. So I have a second part here. It's a shorter section, questions of virtue. I think I can squeeze it in. We started a little bit late, but here we go. How is it that art can save the soul while moving beyond the facts, as Browning suggests in his verse novel's last book, The Book and the Ring? If our human speech is not, our human testimony false, how can we act ethically in the present? Is Browning not merely deferring action to some fantasized eschatological future, thither where eyes that cannot reach yet yearn for all hope, all sustainment, all reward, as he has it in book 1? What is the temporality of the virtuous act in Browning? Once again, Wordsworth's engagement with infinitude provides a useful countermodel of formal temporality. Our destiny, our being's heart and home is with infinitude and only there. The danger of Wordsworth's Something Evermore About to Be is that it threatens to defer endlessly the confrontation with infinite truths that demand action in the present. Wordsworth's Spots of Time also subordinate the experience of the infinite into a Bildungsroman of self-narrativization, the autobiography that is the prelude with the child, now father of the man. EBB's version of the New Jerusalem in Aurora Leigh is quite different, as Emily Allen and I argue in Novel Poetry, opposing the novels and George Eliot's logic of present causes of past effects. That's a phrase from George Eliot. EBB and Byron before her could be said to offer us the present effects of future causes. As EBB puts it in Contiguity Windows, we must plant the great hereafter in this now, which is usefully compared to Browning's own articulation quoted earlier, all poetry being a putting the infinite within the finite. Byron and EBB think outside of a novelistic or historical cause and effect version of temporality. In their, as we argue, future anterior model, we do not work for our children or for the future of the species or for our own self-realization, or even because we want our version of truth to succeed. Byron most clearly articulates the principle that Emily and Allen and I argue the verse novel often adopts. Here's Byron on this way of thinking about action. But onward, it is now time to act, and what signifies self if a single spark of that which would be worthy of the past can be bequeathed unquenchably to the future? It is not one man nor a million, but the spirit of liberty which must be spread. Whatever the sacrifice of individuals, the great cause will gather strength, sweep down what is rugged, and fertilize what is cultivable. And so the mere selfish calculation ought never to be made on such occasions, and at present it shall not be computed by me. I was never a good arithmetician of chances and shall not commence now. End quote. We're driven to act by a universal principle, the spirit of liberty. That universality, in fact, works against the church, according to St. Paul, an important touchstone for Alain Badiou's philosophy, which is why EBB writes in her letters that she, quote, expected a great development of Christianity in opposition to the churches and of humanity generally in opposition to the nations. In such an act, there's no selfish calculation of either the self or the group, however large. We act because we must after confrontation with truths that unveil ethical imperatives, even as we have no idea of the cause and effect temporality or eventuality of that action. As Byron puts it, he's not a good arithmetician of chances. Criticism has tended to dismiss such passages as ideological smokescreen, but that dismissal has kept us from seeing how Byron and EBB offer us a different formal approach to the infinite than we find in either the novel or romantic lyricism. All of these genres are in fact concerned with the infinite, as is our secular understanding and tendency to fetishize any heroic or significant act. However, there are distinct structural ways we can address such a concept, including without some articulation of an infinite that exceeds the calculation of selfish interests or the constraints of custom, we cannot properly make sense of the good or understand how to effect positive change. Locating Robert Browning in the counter tradition we have identified in Byron and EBB helps us better understand the need for the Pope's dramatic monologue near the end of The Ring and the Book. Browning addresses EBB's Pauline formulation in that book. Christianity in opposition to the churches, humanity in opposition to the nations. He even begins, as does E.B.B. Zora Lee, with Ecclesiastes. I'll begin, he writes, and read a history, since as he goes on, of the making books there is no end. Like E.B.B., Browning begins with the extreme skepticism of Ecclesiastes and goes on in The Pope to question any claim to know the truth by addressing examples where papal decrees were overturned, a section made all the more pertinent because of the 1869-70 Ecumenical Council of the Vatican that led to the declaration of papal infallibility. Which of the judgments was infallible? The Pope wryly asks. And much of Ring in the Book is asking us to question the futility of human knowledge. So as we argue in the book, Clough and Meredith don't move much past skepticism, directing their critique instead at the novel and lyricism. What makes love modern in Meredith or in Clough, for that matter, is precisely the loss of its Pauline dimension, followed by a paralytic inability to act in love's name. We're presented with a similar kind of extreme skepticism in Browning, extending all the way back to his madhouse cells. And as in Ecclesiastes, we could say that the ultimate lesson in the Ring in the Book is that all is vanity, human estimation, words, and wind. And yet, influenced surely by the example of E.B.B., Browning in Ring in the Book insists on the at once anti-novelistic and anti-lyric understanding of truth and event that we've seen exemplified as a counter-tradition, or that we argue is a counter-tradition in Byron and E.B.B. For Browning, moral issues are clearly tied up with aesthetic ones, especially narrative's understanding of cause and effect temporality, which we saw resisted throughout the opening book. Now I'm already at 6:50 here. I want to make sure that there's time for questions. So I'm going to skip over a few sections here, but basically I illustrate the ways that the Pope interprets Caponsacchi's decision to protect Pompilia as a heroic act outside of the calculation of self-interest, which he tends and he clearly illustrates is how Guido approaches all of his acts. He's always thinking about what he's going to get out of it. And part of what's interesting about that book is that, especially by exploring how the Molinists are thinking about predetermination and action, is the ways in which, for Browning, what matters is the feeling that one must act in the present, even when one doesn't know where that act will lead, simply because one knows that an injustice has been done, and therefore we must act in the present without any certainty of the outcome of that act. In Browning's model, there can be no selfish calculation of chances. There's not even the reproductive futurism that dominates novelistic thinking about our actions, doing something for the children. As Browning puts it, the act renouncing earth, lands, houses, husbands, wives, and children here begin that other act, which finds all lost, regained, in this time even 100-fold, and in the next time feels the finite love blent and embalmed with its eternal life. The act event, as Browning, the heroic act as Browning understands it, is rather the realization of an eternal truth enacted in the present. This is my last paragraph. By pinpointing an identifiable future anterior structure in 19th century literary history, we can better understand how aesthetic form is related to any ethical act. And by examining the verse novel, we can better understand what it is that the Victorian novel and Wordsworthian lyricism were doing differently, and what we might do differently yet again today. We might even begin to ask ourselves if we can imagine new ways of approaching the task of literary criticism, which we do throughout that book that we just finished. Is there value in approaching our work by way of this counter-tradition? At the very least, we might begin to question, as Weichi Dimmock puts it, the stark antithesis between what is now called otherwise and the real thing. If such a distinction is only a semantic distinction, indeed a fluke, as she puts it, why should we insist so vociferously on it? It is a happenstance, Dimmock writes, a tightening of the causal net in one direction rather than another, one that often for no good reason drastically thins out the range of available options, reducing a multitudinous world to a few hard facts. I've tried in today's talk to loosen that net, to open ourselves to new possibilities by exploring those opened by the verse novel. My hope is to find new counterfactual, alternatively temporal ways to think about the 19th century, and perhaps to locate new ways to think and act in this one. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Dino Felluga. Warm round of applause. Let's unmute everybody. Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. That was a really involved discussion about the 12 books in the Ring of the Book. Can we open this up for questions? Is there anyone that would like to ask Professor Felluga a question?
I apologize for all of the comments that linked it to the rest of the book. It's very hard to pull out a chapter from a much larger project. In fact, it originally was a 2-book project that we then decided to collapse into a single book. So that's there are a lot of different threads in the book, both in the direction of the novel and in the direction of previous verse novels previous to Ring in the Book. So
I actually thought that part of your talk was really helpful. So I didn't feel like it took away from what you were saying. I thought it was really helpful when you put him in dialogue with EBB and with Byron as that counter tradition, because when you when you were talking about that, I was like, yeah, I could see those connections that you were talking about there. So no, I actually really enjoyed that. And then even when you kind of mentioned briefly kind of the verse novels that sort of stay more with the skepticism versus the verse novels like EBB that are looking at how can we, embody these truths in some kind of action in the present, right? So I really enjoyed all of that, but I have literally like 10 pages of notes. So I got so much from it, and I just wanted to, I'm very much looking forward to reading this book and wanting to know when it's out.
Well, yeah, we're looking
now.
It's done. Yeah, it's just a matter now of finding a home for it. But that's, harder in the present day because so many university presses are reducing their lists. So it may take a few months before we, find where the home is for the work.
Yeah. Well, I think, because there's not much out there book-wise on the verse novel, is there? I read one recently.
By Stephanie Markovits.
Yes, I had read that one recently. But in terms of other than that, it's just sort of articles here and there. And it sounds to me like you're taking a very different sort of approach to what she does and with this counter tradition and thinking about it as a tradition rather than just through genre, which is I think kind of more how she talks about it, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, she's a good friend of mine and I really like her book, but it is true that we do it very differently especially because she tends to, as do most scholars, this is how I was taught as a student, she tends to follow the line that poetry is always atemporal and the novel is about cause and effect in the real world. But, if you go backwards through literary history, you realize that these are creations of the 19th century, this idea of the lyric as an atemporal an atemporal genre. That was a fantasy that was really created first, by Wordsworth and Coleridge, and then solidified over the course of the 19th century. So we tried to break that. And one of the ways we do it is to show just how much the novel does engage poetry. And one way you can see that actually, and that's one of the chapters in the book, is just how many novels address Byron. So people have talked about the Byronic hero as a figure, we think Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre, et cetera. But our argument is that it's much more than just like a stick figure Byron in these novels, but that the novels really are hearing this challenge to how you approach representation, how you approach the subject, how you approach questions of virtue. And, we illustrate just how often the novel feels the need to address Byron, all the way up to Felix Holt. That's in the 1860s. So decades and decades after Byron's death, you have George Eliot feeling the need to do a whole novel, basically still trying to work out Byron. That doesn't make any sense unless you, well, we argue, unless you think that the novel really is engaging with the formal and moral aspects of that tradition, going back to Byron, but we think there are really good examples in Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning as well.
Thank you. As I said, very much looking forward to it. So I have other things to say, but I want to give other people a chance.
Pritika.
Thank you so much for your talk, Professor Felluga. It was very helpful. I'm writing a long delayed article on Robert Browning after completing my PhD dissertation. So this is extremely helpful. I just very quickly had a short comment.
And you finished your PhD at Rutgers, is that right?
Yes, I finished my PhD at Rutgers back in 2019. Now I'm studying creative writing in Minnesota State, Mankato. So,
oh, wow. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm in my second year now, so it's and I'm still I'm trying to go through my list of articles one by one. So I have an article coming out on Ruskin and ELH this summer or fall.
Oh, nice.
Yes, and I'm struggling to combine creative and critical writing. So I'm sending one on George Eliot this spring and Robert Browning in the summer. Promise, this summer I will send it out. So just very quickly, I was very interested in what you said about the novel being equated in conventional criticism with the here and now, this particular world, and lyric poetry being equated with the transcendent world, the world of the ideal, and so on. And that's interesting because a lot of criticism that I'm reading is very much in that way. And I also read Professor Markowitz's book. But I'm also, I think I'm working on Hegel as well, Hegel and his influence in 19th century literature. And he has something very interesting to say because he is really breaking down the subjectivity divide. The lyric does deal with the subjective, it does deal with the yearning towards transcendence, but it is that yearning expressed through a commitment to the everyday world and everyday issues of love and just everyday experiences, which I think for anyone who is interested in questioning this, I think Hegel is a great place to look at, and that's something I'm writing on as well. So it's both subjective and immersed, but also lyric is about love. It's about occasional poetry. It's about simple everyday experiences. So it's both subjective and inner, but that is expressed through this kind of commitment or immersion in the everyday world, which I think is another great counter tradition aligned to German idealists and romantics.
Yeah,
but
I'll just add that, I think that when you read because they're very, very complex writings. So when you look at Hegel, you actually read the text, there's so much complexity there. But what interests me is the ways in which Goethe through Hegel, their notions are reduced to this notion, right, of an atemporal lyric, a narrative that's aligned with the epic, and then the dramas, the three, what Jeanette calls architects, right? That's what gets then taught, through the new criticism and then on into the 20th century, which is what Stephanie Markovitz adopts in her work. So the work that's been influential to me is a group of theorists, more recent ones, called Historical Poetics, that's led by Jopi Prins and Jenny Jackson, that asks us to think about the historical trajectory, how we came to think about these generic forms in this way. And I interrupted you, so I'll let you finish your question.
Thank you. That's helpful. So I've been reading Professor Prince's essays as well on historical poetics, and of course Naomi Levine's brilliant work there as well. So that's
and in fact, all of us are in I'll recommend a special issue of Modern Language Quarterly on historical poetics that has Naomi Levine and me and Jopi Prins are all in that one. So that's a good, and the very interesting debate that Jopi Prins has with Cambridge Poetics Group there.
I did my BA there, so yes, they are.
Oh, okay.
They don't like too much history coming into the form.
No, to put it mildly, yes.
I don't mean to talk too much time. Just very quickly, what you said about struggle, the importance of struggle in Browning's eyes. I was just very interested in how it could be extended to his very famous statement towards the end about art may tell a truth obliquely, do the thing that shall breed the thought, nor wrong the thought, missing the mediate word, which I think is such an important thing about his statement about art. Yes, art can capture or can offer a path to a transcendental truth through the here and now, but it is a struggle, and it actually lies in, or that truth or the path to the truth actually lies in the gap between the meaning and the image, that it's not a straight path. You will be jumping, tripping, missing, falling down. And the lack of fit between image and meaning, the lack of that smooth progression, which of course makes Browning so notoriously hard to read, and a lot of
including that passage, which is a particularly thorny one, actually. So that's a great one to point out. Yeah.
I love it. But still, it's just stumble along that passage. So you could talk a bit more about his how he offers a kind of path out, but it's not a particularly comforting or easy one. But it's for all the reason, all the more necessary to constantly struggle through the gap.
Well, and I think that's the logic of Ring in the book. That's why he gives us the narrative in the first 250 lines of the poem in the first book. The narrative's there, and the act happens. But you have to read the whole. The struggle is in reading the next 12 books, and recognizing just how difficult such moral questions. I mean, this is these monologues are being addressed to a judge or a panel of judges, right? The goal is to exonerate oneself, and often there's self-serving reasons. In fact, maybe in all of them, there's some degree of self-serving, even in Pompilia, who's trying to do something good for her son. I mean, and obviously she's clearly the heroine of the tale, but she's also calculating, right? Well, how is this going to play out for my son afterwards? So the struggle is part of the form. The nature of the 12 books, both the difficulty of reading thorny passages like that great one that you just pointed out, but the very act of reading through each book and having to retry, rethink, prosecute, I guess, each of the points of the narrative that are given in the first 150 lines. It's brilliant in that sense, right?
Thank you.
Laura, did you have any thoughts?
Me? This Laura or the other Laura?
No pressure.
James has a habit of calling on people, so you feel like you're back at school and you're like,
yeah, I noticed that. Yeah, I noticed that. I approach all of this material. I have a master's degree in fiction writing from Syracuse University. So I've been working as a journalist, a long form journalist, and as a fiction writer for the last 30 years. So I tend to connect. I mean, I started with Thomas Hardy when I was 16. So, I mean, I fell in love with the Victorians very early. But I tend to make connections to these sort of arcane poems. I mean, I live in San Diego. This is not an intellectual place. I'm not at a university regularly. I really miss all of the words that you were using. I remember those words from lectures long ago. But I mean, for example, when you were talking about the ring in the book and over again telling the story from different points of view, it reminded me of The Thin Blue Line, which I don't know if anyone has seen anymore. It's a film that eventually exonerated someone who had been imprisoned for a crime that he didn't commit by acting out the crime over and over again and filming it from different points of view.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah, right.
So,
yeah. And the other interesting film is Rashomon. So there's another film.
Exactly. Yes. And so I'm actually just constantly amazed by how modern Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning really were, with how many connections there are to the things that we do now, to the things that they were doing then.
Yeah.
And it always proves me wrong, because when I was in school, their poetry wasn't really, other than The Last Duchess, which I love. I just thought their poetry was just way too old fashioned for me. I was in love with Wallace Stevens, but they're not, you can really penetrate that, the archaic language especially of Elizabeth's poetry. And I think there's just so much modern thinking there.
Well,
That's what I love about them.
Woolf loved Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and
I know.
Pound famously
Yes.
said the only thing worth reading in all of Victorian literature is Robert Browning's Sordello, of all things.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just been wonderful to me to discover how wrong I was about the Victorians and how wrong I was about them in particular. So, I mean, I just, when I was listening to you talk, I was on the one hand just enjoying your language, and on the other thinking of these other random connections to modern narrative about crime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's
also,
true.
you haven't mentioned there, Laura, that you'll be coming at some point to talk about your book that will be coming out. She's very, you know, sort of modest there. So it makes sense to me as someone who has a book coming out that you think through the sort of fictional strategies that he's using, and that you're connecting it to film. So it's wonderful to have that other perspective, and Pritika also, who's in creative writing. So I think bringing that together with, you know, and hearing sort of Dino's talk, it's, you know, you offer a lot to the conversation.
There was an interesting question in the chat. I can't tell if it was just to me or to everyone, about melancholia and how Browning.
To you, Dino.
Oh, it wasn't to everybody?
Oh, there it is.
It was sent to everybody, but it says Dino, so I'm going to.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, about melancholia. So that's a good question, actually, because that is one of the things that I look at, not in terms of Coleridge, but rather in terms of Byron, because he was famously melancholic, and sort of, you know, on some level plays the melancholic. He's thinking about the tradition, like going back to the Renaissance, where it became very fashionable to be melancholic, which then goes back to Aristotle, because Aristotle believed that the greatest men are all melancholic. They all have too much black bile. That's humoral physiology of that time period. And then that came back in the Renaissance, Anatomy of Melancholy by for example, in the Renaissance. And then Byron picks that up in the 19th century. And that's one of the things that I explore actually in my previous book, The Perversity of Poetry, is I think through what is the logic of that melancholy in Byron, and how can we understand it as linked to his calls to action in his poetry, which, you know, at the time people really heard. That's why he was so threatening at that time period. Why, you know, once he began to be associated with radical causes, you know, he stopped being the darling of the upper classes and began to be seen as really truly dangerous. I mean, a good example of that is Rylev, and after the Decembrist revolutions, he's taken to his execution after that revolution, carrying a copy of Byron in his hands. You know, we tend to think of, and that's why these stories fascinate me, because the tendency in literary history has been to downplay the significance of Byron, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, as the really popular poets of the 19th century, and that there was something in some ways problematic, I guess, on some level because of their popularity. But there's a logic to it, and there was a real impact that we argue has a logical moral alternative for this time period that Byron exemplified, and many people followed after him. And we think Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning are part of that tradition. A lot of that is driven by his way of thinking about melancholy, to go back to that question.
Well, I personally, the two words that I really got out of the lecture, like the ideas that I really got out of, was the sense of, and this is not something necessarily an argument that I've heard before, but now that you present it in such a way, I can understand why it was, but the idea of a temporality in regards to poetic lyricism, and in regards to the idea of the novel being sort of based in a specific topical time or a location at any given point. And that threw me back to the word that you're using earlier, which was diegetic, which is where he's actually using the ring and the book to make these things happen, which is very temporal in the sense that yellow book does exist. And in fact, Penn Browning donated the yellow book to Oxford with Robert Browning's ring, in which Oxford said, "So this is the ring?" And he said, "No, this is just Robert's ring." but the fact that it brought it into that sense of topicality. So you're making an argument that the verse novel is trying to transcend atemporality and also be topical at the same time.
Yeah.
Is that correct? So, or what would you think on that?
Yeah, well, I'd say that what's interesting about, and this, this is what we try to tease out in the book, is how the verse novel tries to give the lie in different ways, each of these verse novels in different ways, to what was becoming the dominant way of thinking about the novel or of thinking about poetry, especially this idea of atemporal lyric poetry, that each of those verse novels attack both sides. And they show, for example, with the novel, that yes, the novel would like to see itself as this, as realism pointing to universal truths, but tied to especially representation of realistic, objective reality, pure, crude facts, as Browning puts it. But say Meredith's Modern Love, for example. So Meredith was himself a novelist. If you look at that sonnet sequence, it's all about the problems with that way of thinking about novelists. Even though he was himself as a novelist, he's questioning aspects of novel temporality, the seamless logic of cause and effect sequences, all of the things that happen in Modern Love happen in between the sonnets. So he's questioning the logic of cause and effect. He's questioning the logic of character, representation, and depth. He's questioning the nature of subjectivity and memory. And each of the verse novels are doing that. And for example, with regard to the novel, illustrating that within the novel there is a tension. It's not true to say that a novel is all about quotidian reality, because even within the novel, there was a tension and a struggle that persisted throughout the 19th century between an objective representation of real things and a subjective representation of internal thoughts. And the novel very much had poetry in mind as it tried to represent that. This was a real tension. The pendulum was sort of swing in one direction or the other. Eventually, by the modern period, you'll have, novels by Woolf and Joyce that pull it as far over to the poetic side as possible. But any novel includes both, right? That there's always to put it in linguistic terms, a diachronic and a synchronic, to go back to Roman Jakobson's theories. They're both are functioning always within any given form. Some forms may more push in one direction than another, but any novel includes both, and any poem includes both.
Sense you're saying with the verse novel, with having both, they're very deliberately drawing attention to that.
Exactly.
And in deliberately drawing attention to that, they're engaging with that discourse in different ways, maybe emphasizing one over the other, maybe for different reasons, maybe for skeptical reasons, maybe for we must embody in the here and now. So it's very interesting. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And why has it taken until now to begin questioning some of these generic forms? Well, it's the way that we're taught, but it's also just the way in which the academy has developed, so that scholars who become critics basically have to choose. You become a novel critic, and then you're expected to read the novels, and you read the novel criticism, and a particular way of thinking about that genre dominates, and you follow it because that's where the conversation's happening. Or you become a poetry critic and you follow that trajectory. And it's very rare. Like, you go to conferences, it's rare to have, you tend to have novel panels and poetry panels. So even like physically, the two aren't brought together. There are poetry journals.
Of when that happened to me, when I was speaking on Aurora Lee once at the Victorian Poetry 50th anniversary conference. And obviously everyone there was interested in poetry. So like one person came to my talk on the verse novel. It was kind of like involving narrative, and I was just like, I should have known. Shouldn't have talked about the verse novel at a Victorian poetry conference. So exactly.
Yeah. So, we're hoping to change that. The fact of Stephanie Markovitz's book, that's really good. The historical poetics movement, I think, is good. So I think there's a lot of people pushing in a new direction. And I think there's a lot that can be done because when you crack open, when you stop thinking about the novel in a very limited way, or of poetry in a very limited way as this notion of expressivist lyric, lot more can be done and explored in both genres.
Well, is it just the terminology novel in itself that places it in that, temporal period, something new, right? Something novel that's happening.
Right.
So how would you, and I have two questions, but this is just something that came to my mind was, when you deal with, and I don't necessarily know this is your wheelhouse or whatnot, but just the ideology of it is, it's like when you're dealing with something like hard sci-fi or, sort of like really out there sort of, things that haven't happened yet or that will never particularly happen. How does that link back to the temporality of the piece?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I mean, I think that the way that, here's how, there's another philosopher named Dupuy who makes an argument about how to deal with climate catastrophe. And, we finished the book with an epilogue that thinks about climate crisis and other crises that seem impossible to fix. And the first part of the book is about how the novel tends to think about heroic acts. And the tendency is to think about life as a series of cause and effect sequences. And there's a new book, a very good book by Andrew Miller called Lives Unlived in Realist Fiction. And he makes an argument that the way novels work is by way of optative regret. He says that if you read novels, and he teases out this really pervasive mechanism in novels where novels will go back and think about a significant event and that then determines a life. And the novel will lock you into that narrative by having this optative mechanism. Well, if this had happened, then everything would have been different. If only this other thing had happened, then everything would have been different. But that mechanism is just a way to ensure that you're locked into the cause and effect sequence that is understood as reality. The problem with that mechanism is that you tend to wait for someone else to be the one to fix the problems of the present. The narrative is designed in such a way as to be tied to heroic acts and heroic figures that come and act at a particular moment. And this is the problem with, like say climate crisis, right? We wait for the president to change, for a new president to come who will fix the problems of the previous president, or we wait for the scientific invention that's going to capture all of that carbon, right? We wait for someone else to do it. And our argument is that Byron, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Robert Browning in their mechanism is more like Dupuy, which is like science fiction. Dupuy has this vision of the best way to deal with climate crisis or any of these crises is to, in a sci-fi way, send yourself to the future and see the true destruction, the true dystopic sci-fi destruction that is the logical endpoint if we persist in these actions. And then from that point of disaster, this dystopic sci-fi future, come back to the present in full knowledge of what's happening. That way of thinking about action is different. It tends to put the onus on us to act collectively. And this is something that I've been working hard to implement in my own ways. So I've tried to adopt this Byronic, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Robert Browning way of thinking about action in the present, and a lot of the things that I've been doing. So in fact, Pritika was involved in one of those projects, which is COVE, a collaborative organization for virtual education, which is an online project I've done to try to deal with the humanities crisis. So we've created an alternative mechanism for storing information and publishing material. And with regard to climate crisis, I'll be running a flightless conference in 2024, which will be a series of hubs across the world, across North America and the UK and Rome and Australasia, so that nobody needs to get on a plane, but you can still all together have international collaboration and so on. I don't know how well that's going to work, but what matters is that we each try to make it work.
I think it's a fantastic endeavor. So let me bring it back to the text, because in that analysis, I'd like to say that, so the initial murder scenario is taking place in 1698, okay? So the book isn't written till almost 200 years later. So in fact, Robert Browning is indeed doing that. He is looking back and saying that this is the reason why we're addressing the crisis from 10 different perspectives, right? Because there's 10 different perspectives on this crisis, or at least 9 in the book, right?
Yeah.
Ophelia, Guido, Pope Innocent XI. So what he's doing is and from what you were saying in regards to the verse novel, questioning the atemporality of this and that, I don't know if all verse novels do that, but it definitely is in line with what this one is doing. And it seems like that the impact of the ring in the book right now on modern discourse is in fact topical more now than ever. I mean, he's specifically saying, as you mentioned, that art is the only truth, right? And that all this misinformation and propaganda, whether it was in the 1698 or in 1868 when it was published, you know, whether it was for Christianity or the academic systems or the powers that be of the nation states, ultimately, he said, drop all of that. Art and truth are completely the same. And so I think what he's doing is he's addressing the idea that you have to just throw it all out. The misinformation. I mean, right now we're misinformation, fake news, and all that. I mean, would you consider poetry or the verse knowledge to even, or the verse novel to even be considered as Robert Browning as art?
Well, if you're asking me, that's, I don't know. I think the more interesting question is, how do you deal with a present moment where the humanities are in such crisis and are so attacked in political discourse, especially in the United States, you know, where there's such a strong anti-intellectual side to this culture. And, you know, politicians will, regardless of the truth of their claims, because they often aren't true, will dismiss anybody who comes out of an English degree or a philosophy degree as basically baristas in training, because there's nothing for them to do beyond working at Starbucks. That's a very common narrative. And it's one that, in fact, what's interesting is that it's the one thing that Democrats and Republicans are agreed on, because Obama was just as bad at that, you know, did that just as often as Republicans do, denigrate humanistic endeavor. And so that's one of the things actually we talk about in the epilogue to the book is the problems with that and the significance of a humanistic perspective. We say, you know, the verse novel is part of that, but I mean, a larger argument is about the nature of humanistic study, which allows us to think about the historical emergence of our current ways of thinking, that there's no way out of the present without being conscious and following through a longue durée, like, you know, going back centuries, longue durée emergence of our current ways of thinking. That's the key. And that can only be offered by the humanities. STEM disciplines cannot do that. So their claim is to present us with reality, but you can't begin to understand why you think about reality in that way without thinking about the historical emergence of the basic categories that they use to think about the present day.
Well, don't you feel that maybe they have gone out of their way to eliminate the ability for people to even think or remember? In the sense that The Ring in the Book was a hit. That was a hit book. That went off the shelves. Do you think that anybody has the ability to go through The Ring in the Book today? I mean, other than yourself and some of the scholars, the ability to even know what's going on last week by the preponderance of 24 hours media and visuals and this and that, blah, blah, blah. And there's not even held any responsibility to what was said last week, much less what's said today. So you find a gap where they're saying humanities are baristas, right? But those same people that are saying that are hooked on the coffee.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd say, you know, that's the argument that goes back to Plato. You know, he didn't like writing because, you know, it was going to atrophy our brains. We're going to be too reliant on that new prosthesis. So, you know, it's a common argument that goes back in time, but, you know, the writing also makes other things possible. So I'd say a better, you know, I personally,
that's what you're arguing at the end, is a new synthesis.
Yeah, a new way of approaching. I mean, I as an example, yesterday, somebody sent me a link to, I don't know if you saw the New York Times. Here, I'll show you actually while you were talking. I called it up here. this New York Times piece on Auden. So this is an example of how you can do really interesting close reading for the public. And it's this interactive poem. As you read through, he takes you through the sections of the poem. It's an ekphrastic poem, so it links it to the Bruegel painting, other Bruegel paintings, Auden's life, his politics, history, the locations of the poem, his understanding of morality and aesthetics. So it's a good example of how, so these, this is a lot of moving things and images, and, it's technologically savvy, but it does a really good close reading in an interesting way. It does it to a public humanities, right? To a new audience. New York Times has a lot of readers. So I think that a better way of approaching things is to, it may mean that you have to give up some things. So, we can't just keep publishing books. Presses aren't publishing them anymore, for one. So, and commercial providers are taking over our cultural heritage. So we need alternative mechanisms, nonprofit mechanisms, collective mechanisms that allow us to recapture our collective heritage and get our own version of history and literature out to the general public. So I applaud those efforts.
Are there any, I have lots of things to say, but are there any other comments? I'm curious as to what anyone else is. Laura?
No, I was just gonna say I have to go now, but I feel that was a wonderful line to sort of conclude with, like thinking about the public humanities and, like you said, the kind of problem with academic books. And I see from what you're saying how you're even doing that within your book itself, right? Connecting the Brownings and these Victorian writers to kind of tracing the development of kind of a thought almost, right? Like how they were, through their kind of formal experimentations, drawing attention to how we think and separate things, and the fact that at the end you're then applying this to what's going on now. And this idea of kind of, like, I guess, like you said, we will lose certain things, but the academy isn't just the few people that can read The Ring and the Book anymore, right? And nor should it be, right? How do we connect it to the things that the Brownings were intensely interested in, right? That you're right, like a humanities training, a humanities education is the only thing that can really address and face the problems that we're experiencing today. So I really enjoyed that. I just want to say thank you so much, and it was actually a real pleasure to have you here. So I have to head out, but I just want to say hi. I'm Pritika and Laura, everyone. So good to see you, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you for the excellent questions.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Well, and the reason why I was saying anything about this, is because there have been several academics, and what they've done is, and they were poets, and they've designed, and the one example, I guess, is this video game called Disco Elysium.
Oh, I don't know that.
Yeah, it's called Disco Elysium. It's out of Poland. Like, I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine, so I understand, like, that was the last place that my books were bought at. But, like, the books are going out. I don't know if they're going to make a return and what fashion or what not. But if you make it into an interactive video game experience, and that's something like The Ring of the Book could be, 1968 serial killer novel, I mean, that could be something that it reintroduces the art form into a new genre until, that goes away and you have to do something else or this and that, the other. But I think what you were shooting for as your answer was that we have to rethink the way that these ideas are presented, because they're very important. The idea of truth and beauty, we don't get that on the news.
Yeah, well, I'm not opposed to games. I have one of my inspirations. I worked a lot with Jerome McGann, and that was his thinking, is that you needed to, he has a game that he created called the Ivanhoe Game, based on a Scott novel, where basically people come in and you have to try to understand the narrative trajectories of the work, and you propose alternative temporalities. That's how you win the game, is how believable your alternative timelines are. sort of like the connection between Wide Sargasso Sea and the other novels that it engages with, the alternative histories that it provides. So it's sort of a game like that. And I have another scholar, Jason Camlott, who for a while created this book called The Victorianator. Unfortunately, it's not available anymore, nor is Ivanhoe. So this is the other problem, is creating games that are actually sustainable in the long term. So that's another problem.
Need beautiful artwork.
Maybe,
yeah. Which brings it back to the truth. I mean, I just really love the idea when you said liberty, universality in art, because those are the truths that we need to be exposed to right now more than ever. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're being denied. We're being put into camps. You're either for this or for that, or this or that. And art, what is art? It's pornography. And liberty, liberty is just a bunch of terrorists and trucks, in Canada or something. I don't know what the narrative is, but it's definitely not something that's exposing the idea of truth being beauty. The truths that they're presenting are very disgusting and ugly these days.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Ukraine, and that's, I think, one reason why it has captured the world's imagination.
Have you ever had a chance to go or be a part of like the Lviv Literary Festival or any of the things that go on?
I have not, no.
It was one of the few places that poet was on the top as opposed to lawyer.
Ah, right.
And so that's why got to get rid of it. Got to, that's, you understand what I'm saying? There's a cultural heritage there in Ukraine where poetry is one of the top social positions to be in. And regardless of what side you're on, it's a wash because you're getting rid of it, Right. And I think that we should value our cultural history and value our cultural literature and value verse and value, novels as novel as they are. Mm-hmm. And I really appreciated that your discussion was looking towards a future for that, because I think that's the optimism that people need, especially in your field,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, there's a lot of resistance in my field, in the academy, because it changes slowly, and people are slow to change. But things are clearly happening along those lines, and simply trying to resuscitate what was before, I think that's not going to get us anywhere, just further in a hole. So I'm all for rethinking in terms of public humanities and alternative ways of salvaging the heritage in a sustainable way.
Sure.
So that's the other thing I'm really keen to do. And if that means learning from business people, which I did a whole year's training in entrepreneurship here at Purdue to try to figure out a more sustainable way to support this Cove platform that I'm building, which I'm doing through institutional subscription. If that's what it takes, learning from the devil in order to save a nonprofit collective project, so be it.
Candace, what were your thoughts on the lecture?
I think you're muted.
All right, I got it. It was very interesting. I haven't finished reading that. I need a little more time, The Ring and the book, but I just thought
it's
it was
a long
really
one.
Yeah.
21,000 lines.
But I will stick with it. I just thought it was really interesting, the variety of perspectives and how everyone seemed to have a very different take, whether it was influenced by morals or the times or which parties you knew.
Well, keep with it. And Pritka, did you have another thing to say before we're closing the meeting off?
Just to quickly round off, I was thinking about what was said about literature and the role of literature in the present day. And I was thinking, in addition to everything that's been said, liberality, universality, one thing that I think what sets literature apart from other kinds of discourse is its sheer complexity. And I'd like to point not to a critical quote as such, but I'm studying creative writing and I'm currently obsessed with Alice Munro. And she talks about something that I think is very pertinent to the things we discussed about Browning. She says that she's trying to get at the complexity of things, the things within things, which just seems to be endless. Nothing is easy. Nothing is simple. And I think that is what literature can get at in a world where all the discourses, for all the complexity, and be it in philosophy, sociology, and so on, everybody is looking towards simplification and coming at a perfect solution. And here you have literature, you have the likes of Browning saying that no, struggle and difficulty, that is where beauty lies, that is where hope for transcendence lies, that is where morality lies. And that is something that I think sets literature apart from other kinds of discourse, without trying to fetishize literature too much. It is something that we can get through in literature, and that is its greatest strength. And sadly, it's in this world of, limited attention spans and competition for funding. It's also sadly its greatest weakness, because how do you get that complexity out in a way that makes sense to everybody, from like funding committees to the general public, to tell them that in difficulty, you find beauty, you find some kind of meaning. The fact that there is no one truth, but that is no reason to give up. That is in fact the reason to keep reading, keep stumbling and missing, and try and kind of celebrate the different perceptions there are, while not letting go of the idea of a commitment to truth and justice. So Browning's Pope, for instance, is very much aware of, the rags of speech, but he still gives a judgment. It's not like both sides are great, so let's not have any judgment. It's accepting complexity, celebrating it, while also deriving a kind of moral responsibility in it. I think that's what literature is doing, and that's something that that's something that if we are hoping to write for a broader public, how to tease it out and write it in a way that people will enjoy reading and will not scare them.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
a great challenge.
Yeah, as I say, I do like that one New York Times article that I just showed you. And I'd say that I've written on just what you're saying, because that's one of the aspects of problems of the internet, is its tendency to bring everything to its lowest common denominator. Well, Wikipedia is a good example. I really like Wikipedia. It's really helpful, but the nature of the genre is to, no matter how long the article, it gives us, sorry?
Streamline it.
Yeah, it streamlines it and it limits it. It's a similar problem with Google. Any Google search is that it changes, and as do all these algorithms. So algorithm of Facebook, et cetera, changes the nature of what it is that's being given to us. And we know that that's what's driving the misinformation campaign. So I have this article, Can Victorian Studies Reclaim the Means of Production? That basically makes this case, right? That why we need to salvage a humanities approach to just what you say, Pritika, the complexities of all of these problems, moral problems, ethical problems, formal, aesthetic problems, and so on. The internet right now is set up in such a way as to work against that way of thinking.
I think almost at this point, people have to ask the question in regards to what Pritika said about, comedies and this and that. People have to ask themselves, why am I even being exposed to truth? Because it's not a commonplace thing for them to even have to deal with that. So like they would most likely want to go with the narrative, regardless of what it is. So the novel has become our news almost, it's there's no questioning of the narrative. So whereas you have in The Ring of the Book, 9 different perspectives on a particular thing, and you have Guido writing this, and then like you said, that he's impostoring a poet that doesn't exist. I mean, it's fascinating to see all the different levels, and they've taken that as like a rote way to produce information for people. It's really bizarre. No one's questioning anything. If you go against any sort of thing that comes out, then you get put in a category or a camp, or you're not published, or you're not this, or you're not that, and that's very scary, because we've seen how that aligns historically with the assassination of poets and writers and the elimination of freedom of speech.
Right. Yeah, it's a tough and thorny issue. I mean, an example of just how complex it is I don't know if you ever watched the Stephen Colbert, back when he was in persona as a Republican person. He had this term truthiness. Mm-hmm. And there was a great moment where in character, he addresses Bush directly at a correspondence dinner with all of the critiques of his administration, but within the persona speaking about truthiness.
Sure.
that's a very postmodern moment, and that character and the way in which he addresses the problems of the present kind of speaks to the difficulties of this present moment, let's say. So it is complex. It's complex even to see what the best mechanism is for mounting an effective critique, given the current situation.
I'd say it's probably billions of dollars of support from a corporate or pharmaceutical entity.
That is part of it, and everything is set up right now in the present to support. I'm going to give you an example. So, I'm trying to set up this nonprofit called Cove, and so I did this entrepreneurship academy, and where I was, working with. I was the only humanist. All the others were STEM faculty members, engineers, scientists, people doing drugs that they want to sell to the
micro dosing,
all of that, so it was really eye-opening because the federal government, the U.S. federal government, provides through a SBR, STTR program, 3.2, it might be 3.3 billion with a B, not an M, $billion to faculty to pursue for-profit companies. Usually with the goal of eventually then getting angel donors even beyond that to establish these ventures. It's why something like Facebook or Tesla could exist for so many years without making any profit, just losing money because of this amount of money that gets pumped in. What was so fascinating to me is that if you're a nonprofit, you're not allowed to touch that money. You're not allowed to apply. So the entire system, billions, literally, of dollars is oriented to for-profit entities designed to make money, even if it's faculty members looking to establish companies for their intellectual labor. None of that is available to the nonprofit. So if you want to try to pursue something that's nonprofit that tries to solve things in a collective fashion, you see just what a difficult time you have when obviously you're going to have an easier time succeeding if you have those kinds of deep pockets.
Whereas Coleridge and EBB had to afford their own laudanum.
Right. Help. That's right. Maybe that's a good point. Good point to stop, because I think we're almost up to 2 hours here, so I don't want to overstay my welcome here. And you probably all
welcome,
have.
Dino, it's fascinating that you haven't done it's not that you haven't done the research, but there is a lot of research in regards to the Browning societies, the fascination with them. So in the United States, there was thousands of Browning societies, and it was really made up of women that, could not at that point access the college institutions or this or that. So like, for a good example, the New York Browning Society was established in 1907. I think the first president of the New York Browning Society that wasn't a woman was like 1984. And what it was just an opportunity for women or people that were outplaced from this quote, quote, corporate academic system at that time to be able to talk about these ideas, truth and art and beauty. And that was what really pushed the Browning Society so much that like they had bigger participation in Houston, Texas in a baseball game. And I mean, there's Unitarian ministers that put down the Browning and pick up the Bible, And so it was, at that time, it was a revolution. And they say it was the first British invasion of the United States was the Browning Society, just mainly on Robert Browning. EBB obviously played a huge part in the whole women's rights and suffrage and the abolitionists. She was really one of the first, but I just wanted to welcome you and thank you for coming to the New York Browning Society. We're still here, we're still alive, and it's been an absolute joy to have you. I'd like to ask everyone to give a round of applause one more time for Dr. Dino Felluga. And let's not make this such a horrible historic thing. You should be back in the future, and I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Always happy to talk about Browning or EBB for that matter. So it's my pleasure. Thank you very much, everyone. And I hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Dino.
Ciao.
Thank you, Pratik. Thank you, Candice. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
You guys have a great night.
Ciao.
Ciao. And this is where the after hours show begins. We got the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So what did you think? Come on, you're leaving too? All right. Field Sharon Prize Medal Medallion. What was your thoughts? I'm going to ask you to unmute you. So I think you have something to say.
Hello, James.
Hi, how are you? So what were your thoughts
I'm
on the meeting?
here. Oh, it was great. I truly enjoyed it. I
Kind of fun,
enjoyed
right?
having the opportunity to make some comments in writing with the chat to Dino and also to Pratika. They're wonderful folks. As are you, of course, your handsome self.
Well,
Well,
I'm sure I'll get hit by a car and you won't say the same thing, but at the end of the day,
no, I'm not going to be a cougar about it quite, although it might be a good idea.
But did you enjoy the conversation?
Yes, I did. It was a wonderful, deep look into Robert Browning.
Well, that's the
So
thing
it
about
was a
Robert Browning is that, like, we talk about poetry with the Browning Society, but what we overlook a lot of the time is all the plays and like this verse novel that he wrote. Like, there's so much stuff. The Return of the Druzes, Sordello. I mean, these are just immaculate pieces of literature that don't necessarily get put into the poetry category, but also don't have necessarily any other category to belong into. So I thought it was interesting to explore this idea of the verse novel versus the temporal versus the this, that, and the other, because I think they were really ahead of their time, I think.
Oh, I agree with you on that. It's so all-encompassing, I would say, with both Elizabeth and Robert in so many different literary genres, as you say, novels, poetry. I think people, when they first come to the Browning Society, expect it to be all poetry, but once you investigate and delve into both Robert and Elizabeth, there's so much there. It's really difficult to reach out and understand all of it. So you're really right about what you said here this evening about them.
Yeah, Herb Klitzner always refers to it as the web or the nexus of the Brownings. They absolutely knew everybody. So it was their letters, it was their conversations, it was their positions on particular, issues at the time that really just sort of brings it all together. Like, it was more than just poetry. And that's why I was suggesting the video game approach, actually, because that way you can kind of bring in a lot of stuff. I don't know if that's the future. I don't know what the future is, but I do believe that, when we went back to the caves, to the fires, and we were doing poetry, the original, recitation of our own human history, that still has a power, and that the world around us has done everything to disempower that. They put comedy up on number one. Comedy, like, you want to laugh? We got laughs. You want all this, but no one wants you to talk really about sort of this other big esoteric ideas or these big other ideas, because they don't want you to, And so we're freedom fighters in a lot of ways, I think.
Well, I'm in agreement with you about the video games. I know that Ivanhoe sounds like a really wonderful and even educational way to look at literature. I think of things like, Grand Theft Auto, and the abysmal misery of games like that teach nothing and lead children into delinquency.
Violence,
and
pornography, that's what
exactly, yeah.
they're not offering you high art. They're not offering you poetry. They're not offering you great ideas. They're offering you the worst of the worst, and they're saying, this is the best we have, and you're going to love it.
I have this one game I play. It's not really a video game. Well, maybe you could call it that. It's Wordscapes. It's a vocabulary builder, and as one who writes poetry, reminds me to continuously develop and enrich my verbal capacity. So, it's so sad that children are just torn away from the better things in life, from decency and humanity, by some of these really awful video games, as you mentioned.
Yeah, it's a sad state of affairs, but
it is.
I think there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I think Dr. Dino Felluga referenced the idea that there are better things to come, and hopefully, if we put our collective minds to a better understanding of what humanities is in regards to an appreciation or a power for the human power. Michel Foucault would call this biopower. And that biopower is worth more than any of the nuclear weapons, because if humans really get together on some of these big ideas, we can change things. And it's
Certainly.
not, yeah. And so, keeping this alive to me is a part of that resistance to the current narrative. And I'm just very happy that you made it out to the meeting and that you enjoyed the talk. But we're going to get.
Well, I was having some trouble last month with my internet going off. I don't know if I just reached the cap or what had happened. So I was very, very, very sad to miss last month's meeting, and I had indeed looked forward to it with great anticipation. So
Well,
anyway, I wanted to thank you for organizing this meeting, and I hope that there's one day in the sooner rather than the later future when we can finally be back at our beloved National Arts Club and in-person meetings, even if we have to face mask, which is pretty much the norm now, and of course provide our cards showing that we're vaccinated and boosted.
Yeah, well, here's the deal. The National Arts Club is really expensive now, so I'm thinking maybe.
Oh.
I'm thinking maybe 5th Avenue and 12th Street, the First Presbyterian Church, not so far, but also a beautiful building with a lot of history, right across from, what's the other, I don't know, but it's right. You know what I'm talking about. The first.
I do. I've lived in Manhattan. I'm on Staten Island, but I've probably lived in Manhattan, 12,
that might be
15 years.
To,
that place you had, what was it, last fall?
I like that place a lot, but you have to walk. You have to walk all the way.
It is a long walk.
And
yeah.
for our older members, it's a very hard place to get to. Yeah.
That's true. And I came by bus and took the long walk, which I wasn't overwhelmed by that, and had a place to sit in the park for a few minutes on the way back. But I didn't notice any real parking near there either.
Yeah, well, with
just street parking,
$6, $7, $8, $9 an hour, if you get parking, that's probably cheaper than driving, right?
Yeah. Oh, well, we'll find a good place. This one you mentioned, the church, sounds good.
I'm worried. I'm not worried about anything, but I think that keeping it in that 14th Street Union Square area where everyone can easily access the trains within a 2 to 3 walking block distance is really our sweet spot. So we're shooting for the May luncheon to be somewhere in that area, and we'd like to do it in person.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. So we have a great speaker for next month. And then May, hopefully we'll have the high school award-winning, poetry winners and a good speaker, and be able to meet in public, because a lot of our members, they just are not accessible to the Zoom or this and that and the other. And we'd like to have everybody out, and, I'd like to give you a hug or this, that, and the other. It would be like the human element.
Be careful.
The human element to the humanities,
I was going to ask if we were ever going to see our wonderful high school poets again, ever.
We're working on it.
Good. I'll be looking forward.
It was a pleasure seeing you.
Yes, you too. It's kind of dark here, but I had an exorbitant I have electric heat, which is sky high, and also with natural gas, which
you can only afford
friends
the
of mine have.
Not the heat. Yeah, I get it.
I try to keep the bill as low as possible.
I hear you.
So I can buy more poetry books.
Absolutely, and we got poetry books to sell, so it'll be a fantastic time. Let's shoot for May in person. And we can also do, I think, a cross-breed where we do a Zoom meeting and an in-person meeting. So
a lot of people do that. That's a good idea, too.
That would be kind of cool.
Yeah, I hope so. Once May is here, we'll have warmer weather, so the traveling will be easier.
It'll be fantastic. We'll see all the winning kids, poetry. It'll be like old times. No lunch.
I'll be happy to hear about it.
The luncheon out. The luncheon was a little expensive. So
I think May is a good month.
It is indeed. Well, it was a pleasure seeing you, and we look forward to seeing you for next month's meeting.
Sure enough, I'll be looking forward to the notice in the email.
Absolutely.
Great evening, James. Thank you so very much.
No problem.
Good to see you too.
Candace, it's good to see you.
Nice to meet you. All right. Everybody have fun.
Nice to meet you, Candace.
Bye.
So what did you think, Candace, of the meeting?
I enjoyed it. I really liked Dino. He's easy to listen to.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, Herb and Bob Kramer and all these other old farts, they couldn't meet us apparently. So
yeah, it's a bummer.
Yeah, well, it is what it is. I mean,
We can be hopeful for next month and for May.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, all of you guys have a great night. It was good seeing you. take care of yourselves, and we'll call this for the evening at 7:56. That's a good one. 2-hour meeting.
Pretty good.
Take care of yourselves. You guys have a good night.
Good night.
And for all of you watching on Facebook.